Good afternoon. It's good to have you join us for lesson number 5 in our series of Agents of Reconciliation in a Fractured World. And today we're going to be focusing on the whole idea of fractured economy. And we certainly will see that in our own society today with over 41 million people unemployed and a struggling economy to try to recover in the midst of the coronavirus. So this is a very relevant kind of topic for us today. And we're going to be looking into a wonderful little book in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth. Most people would not think of looking there for principles in relationship to economy, but it is a wonderful book that shows us how Israel provided for the poor and how their economy was based on some wonderful principles that really helped everyone. And so we just look forward to going into that passage and being able to. I'd like to bring up my PowerPoint at this time and we'll get started. So as we mentioned, we're looking at being agents of reconciliation in a fractured economy. And I'd like to start out with a quote from a book that I read by Nathan McClellan. And the title of it was, What is the Christian Vision of Economic Life? And I thought it was very relevant for us. And so I thought I'd just share this quote with you. It says, economics is not just about money and wealth, but it's about the distribution of goods and services. When the focus of distribution is lost to primarily making money, which is motivated by greed, then the system becomes corrupt and oppressive. This is true whether you embrace a economy of capitalism or socialism or even communism. The problem is that fallen human nature, which seeks self-interest, which is really our own selfish desires, over community, causes us to lose the sense of equity and equality. And so instead of mankind as autonomous individuals, the scriptures present human person as embedded in a series of relationships with others, with God and with other persons and with the rest of creation. So what he's trying to point out here is that we are not isolated, we're not autonomous. Whatever we do affects everyone else around us. So we were really a part of a broader economy, first at our family and then our local community, and then of course the global side of our economy as well. So rather than freedom from others, the biblical understanding of freedom is primarily freedom for others, for God and for other human beings, and also for the rest of creation. Dietrich Bonhoeffer captures this notion of freedom superbly when he writes, freedom is a relationship between two persons. Being free means being free for the other, because I am bound to the other. Only by being in a relationship with the other am I free. So once again, it's battling against that sense of autonomy and selfishness and us wanting to gain material gain or use the economy for our own personal gain rather than thinking of others and serving others with what God has entrusted us in terms of our stewardship before the Lord. So I want to talk through a number of definitions because I think it's important for us to understand the differences between some of the various terms that are used. And so we mentioned early on the whole idea of racism, classism, those kinds of terms. So classism is the systemic oppression of subordinated class groups to advantage and strengthen the dominant class group. It is a systematic assignment of characteristics of worth and ability based on social class. So we are really divided along the lines, and we use these terms all the time. There's a lower class, there's a middle class, there's an upper class. And even in using those terms, it makes implications. So if you're of a lower class, you're seen in different ways than if you are part of the middle class or the upper class, because we're looking at not only the possessions, but there's sort of their status in terms of life and the hierarchy that we have in our own society. So it's easy to look down on someone who's at lower class rather than realizing they have the same value before God as someone who would be upper class because they're blessed with finances or have been successful in their enterprises, and therefore they might have greater value than someone else. And so once again, it comes back to that sense of both equality and equity within our society. We live in a capitalistic, and the biggest discussion today is through capitalism and socialism. So I thought it would be good for us to look at both of those definitions. So capitalism is an economic system in which investment in and ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange of wealth is made and maintained chiefly by private individuals or corporations, especially as contrasted to cooperatively or state-owned means of wealth. So capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So the big debate today is looking at the various political parties, and one embracing capitalism and the other one embracing a sense of socialism. And you have to realize that when even we use the word capitalism, there's a great variety of expressions of capitalism. So capitalism can be everything from oppressive to being very equitable. So one is not necessarily better than the other. It's how they're used and how we implement them, and whether we use what God has given to us as stewards to serve those around us. Socialism is a way of organizing society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the governments rather than by individual people and companies. So once again, socialism can take a variety of expressions. You have socialism that is in Russia. You have socialism that is in England. They're very different from each other. One is ruled more by a Marxist type of philosophy. The other one is ruled much more in terms of helping mankind and being able to serve the population and make sure that they're taken care of. So once again, when we use a term, we can load it, and that's what's happened in our political debate today, that some of these terms are loaded as with great negativity as over against others. And really, there's a part of our own culture that is about socialism. When we talk about in terms of the welfare system, we are taking care of the poor, and that is a side of socialism, but it's also a responsibility that we have. If we look at our retirement funds and what we get in terms of our income from the government, that's really a form of socialism as well. But once again, we don't want the government to have control over everything. We want to have private enterprise. We want to be able to invest in our own futures. And so we need all of those options that come under the guise of capitalism. Communism is a theoretical economic system developed by Karl Marx, which is characterized by collective ownership of property and by the organization of labor for the common advantage of members. So once again, it's more of the collective side. So everyone working, no one really owns anything. So we all do this for the better of the government and for the better of our nation. There's also the term consumerism. So we are in a very consumer-oriented society. So consumerism is the theory that increasing consumption of goods is economically desirable. Also a preoccupation with and an inclination to buying of consumer goods. And so our television ads are always based on, oh, if you buy this, then it gives you a different sense of status. So it's not about something becoming obsolete. It's more of something that you need to have in order for you to have a certain status in this world. Materialism is the preoccupation with an emphasis on material objects, comforts, and considerations with a disinterest in or rejection of spiritual, intellectual, or cultural values. So it's really about just amassing your own goods or your own riches, and so the more we have, the more we feel like we're going to be content, which is really untrue because we know people that have great wealth and yet are very dissatisfied with life, and many times there's a very high suicide rate within those who have a lot in terms of materialism. Two terms that I think we need to look at, and we'll see these played out in the book of Ruth. One of those is welfare, is a government-provided support system for those unable to or unwilling to support themselves. And so we have adopted that back in the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. We had the whole social welfare program developed. And it was both a good thing and a bad thing, because once people learned to use the system, then they had less incentive to work. And so if the government would provide for me, then if I had more children, I got more income. So there was a side of that that was very destructive to our own society. The other side, in which I've worked with most of my life in terms of working in inner city communities, is workfare. And it's a support system that requires those receiving benefits to perform some work or to participate in job training. And I really like that because, once again, it has a person taking responsibility for their life and not just submitting their life to a government and a government program where they're sustained. And so I think it's important for us to look at that. When you study the Old Testament, it was intriguing to me, and I didn't know this until I really got into studying the Hebrew, but there are 5 different Hebrew words for the poor. And each of these words give us a unique understanding of why that person is poor and what should be our approach to helping that person. So as we look through these words, you'll see the implications and how we need to be able to respond. So when we say someone is poor, or we want to talk about the poor, we have to realize there are an incredible variety of situations that create poverty. And we need to have a certain sense of sensitivity to that and a certain compassion of how we respond. So there are 2 words, ani and yaresh. And they indicate a person that is facing poverty because of oppression by an unjust system or individual. They are denied the right to earn a living because of unjust actions. They need justice more than they need physical help. If justice occurred, then they would become productive. So these people need judges and elders or government officials who would do the right thing and bring about justice. So when someone's put into slavery, or if someone has been abused and taken their property taken away from them, or whatever the circumstance might be, there might be some unjust kind of thing that has robbed them of their wealth or of their ability even to provide for themselves. They need justice rather than just pity or a handout. They really need to have someone who would step up and help them get out of their situation. The other the other word is dal and dalah. And so this refers to someone who cannot work because they have a disability or are sickly and cannot work. So these kind of people, we need to come alongside of them and provide care and opportunities for them to be constructive. And these people also in the Old Testament often were helped and employed by the temple. So there were certain gifts given to the temple, and they were used for distribution for those who had a very legitimate need. And many times that would be some type of physical disability. So it's intriguing to me that within the Old Testament, it makes these kinds of distinctions so that we just don't lump everybody under the same category when we talk about the poor. The other word is ebion. which indicates a person who has experienced a calamity which has wiped out their possessions and interrupted their ability to work, and they need immediate help or relief, such as housing or clothing, so they can get back to work. So someone who has a house catch on fire or been in a car wreck or something like that, this is the kind of person. So the book of Job is one that really calls onto this word, ebion, where Job has had everything wiped out. And so he needs that immediate help, that sense of comfort to come alongside of him. So those are four major words that have to do with circumstances that sometimes are beyond our control and that we don't have a lot of ways of responding. And so we need help, whether it be justice or whether it be support from because I have a disability and I need to get back on my feet, or some calamity has happened to me. The last word, rush, indicates a person who is poor because they are lazy or have made bad choices, such as gambling and addictions. And so these people need accountability and structure, and not handouts which contribute to their problems. So we see this in our own society, so we need to have a different sense of approach to those people where giving them something is not going to be helpful to them, because they're going to turn right around and use it to support their own addictions. And so we've seen this many, many times. I used to take my students down to LA, and we went to one of the major parks there where all of the homeless people gathered. And my assignment to my students was to sit down with at least three homeless people and sort of hear their story, etc. And then just kind of warn them to say, each of these individuals now is going to try to con you into giving them money to help them. And so you're going to have to be very wise on how you respond. So one of our students, when the gentleman was asking him about helping him, he said, well, I'll help you, and I'll take you up to McDonald's here and I'll buy you a hamburger. And so he took the gentleman up, and the gentleman said, I'm really hungry. I'd like to have 2 hamburgers. And so they bought him 2 hamburgers. The guy walked right outside, never ate the hamburgers, turned right around and tried to sell them to someone else so he could get money to be able to support his system or his habit. So it just realizes how sort of the ingenuity of some of these people, if they would use it to get back on their feet and to work, would be a whole different way of life for them. So the book of Ruth is just a marvelous book. And this is a quote out of it's called the Theology of Work Project. And the Theology of Work Project looks at the scriptures and looks at God's design in terms of how, as we work, it brings dignity and it brings importance to our lives, but it also that we work because God has gifted us and that we're stewards of the gifts that we have been given. And so this is a quote out of their theology in terms of work project. And I thought it was a good series or a good summary of what the book of Ruth is about. The book of Ruth tells the extraordinary story of God's faithfulness to Israel in the life and work of ordinary people, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. As they work through both economic hardship and prosperity, we see the hand of God at work most clearly in their productive agricultural labor, their generous management of resources for the good of all, and respectful treatment of coworkers, and ingenuity in the face of necessity, and the conception of raising of children. So throughout everything, God's faithfulness to them creates opportunities for fruitful work, and their faithfulness to God brings the blessing of provision and security to each other and to the people around them. So it really kind of summarizes the whole book of Ruth, because the book of Ruth is really about Naomi, who is married to a gentleman called Elimelech, and his name actually means a sort of a child or a king. A king of God, actually, is what his name means. And each of the names in the book of Ruth has importance to them. And so it really has to do with the daughters, the sons of Elimelech and Ruth, who they have they have their children. And I'm going to read just this first part because I think it gives you the setting of the story. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and his wife Naomi, and the names of their two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, which one means weak and the other one means frail. And they were Ephratites of Bethlehem of Judah. And now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. And Elimelech's, Naomi's husband died, and she was left with her two sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the other name of the other one was Ruth, and they lived there for about 10 years. And then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of their children and her husband. So they're really left destitute. And so Naomi decides that she is going to go back to Israel, to Bethlehem, where she was from and where her husband was from. And so she says to the two Moabite wives of her daughter-in-laws that you need to just go, and you're young, and you need to find another husband, and I can't provide for you, so you need to be able to go and find a new life. Well, Orpah goes back to the Moabites, but Ruth says, I'm going to be able to stay with you. I want to go where you want to go. And there's a beautiful passage in chapter 1 of Ruth, which is used in a lot of wedding services, and it's a beautiful statement of commitment. It's found in verse 16 of chapter 1. Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And thus may the Lord do unto me, and worse, if anything but death parts me from you. And when she saw that she was this determined to go with her, she said no more to her. And so they both went and came to Bethlehem. So there's within this passage, you see sort of a conversion that happens, even though she's a Moabitess. She says in this passage, your people will be my people, and your God, my God. So she does embrace the God of Naomi, Jehovah God of Israel, and she follows her back to Bethlehem. When they get back there, we're now introduced into the side of economy, because for them to survive, Israel had provided a way for them to be able to do this. And I'll pick this up in chapter 2 and verse 1. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one whose sight I may find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So Ruth departed and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And when she had happened to come upon a portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And now, behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, may the Lord be with you. And they said, and may the Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servants, who is in charge of the reapers, and whose young woman is this? And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, she is a young Moabite woman who has returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. And he said, and she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and remained from morning until now, and has been sitting in the house for a while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter, and do not go and glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from them, and what your servants draw. And then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight, and why should I take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of her husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you came to seek refuge. Very beautiful passage here. So in Israel, there was this principle of gleaning that provided a way for the poor to feed their families. And there's also in this passage a kinsman redeemer. She mentions this, there is a kinsman of my husband. And that allowed women to be able to inherit the land that was purchased by their husband. And we'll find out a little bit more about this in just a few moments. So some of the principles in terms of the book of Ruth, when you come to the book of Ruth and saying, what really is going on in terms of the land, and what right does Naomi have, and she to be able to get the inheritance of Elimelech, and so how does she able to do that? So there is a principle of land ownership in the Old Testament. Genesis places the earth under the rulership or stewardship of humankind with dominion and authority. However, we are to bring it to its full and potential, not to ravage or rape it for personal or selfish desires. So we are really stewards of the land. And when God chose Israel through Abraham, there were three elements to the Abrahamic covenant. One was the land. He was going to give them a land that they had not seen before, and it was going to be given to them. They were to raise up a generation, so it had to do with seed. I'm going to bless you, and you're going to multiply throughout the earth. And then also a blessing, that you will bless the nations of the earth, and that those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. So there is part of this Abrahamic covenant that always has to do with the land and the people inheriting the land. So once the children of Israel went in and conquered the land of Canaan, then the land was distributed under Joshua, and each family, and each tribe had their own portion of the land. And so it was given to them in perpetuity. So it would always remain in the name of the individuals, especially the husband. But the wife would be able to inherit that land if the husband died, and there were principles about that. So God's promise to Israel was the land, and therefore all the laws given to Israel have to do with the land belonging to the 12 tribes in perpetuity. Every 7 years and every 50th year, the land would revert back to its true owner. So there was always that sense of land being owned by the individuals to whom God had given it. So economy and sustainability was tied to the land and the family that owned that land. And so Naomi understood this concept. That's why she brings up in this very first verse of chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman of great power, great wealth from the family of Elimelech. And so his name was Boaz. So Boaz understood also that he was a steward of the land, and that he used the land then to redeem Ruth, and we'll see that in just a few moments. So economy and sustainability was tied to the land and the family that owned that land, and Boaz was a steward of that. So the principle of gleaning we find in Leviticus chapter 19 and verses 9 through 10, and I just want to read part of that passage to you out of Leviticus. I have it here, I think. The principle of gleaning is based on God's blessing of abundance and not scarcity. So it was always that you cannot take as you harvested the fields, you could not take the corners. You had to leave the corners, and those were for the people to be able to glean from that. And so Leviticus points us out very clearly that there's always a provision for the poor. It was voluntary, not mandatory, so you could be as stingy as you wanted to or be as generous as you wanted. But you had to answer to God and not the government. So it was God who was going to watch you, and if you treated those generously, then God would say, I'll treat you generously. This provision was about equity and not necessarily equality. Those are two really important terms for us. Equity has to do with providing opportunities for people to be able to advance, to move forward, to be able to be sustainable in terms of their own self efforts. Equity, so it gives them the opportunity. Equality means that we all have something on an even level, and that's never going to be true in the world. There's always going to be richer people, poorer people, etc. So equality is, I don't think, something we're ever going to really obtain. We always want to be able to give people equal opportunity. That's another way of looking at it. But equity has to do with providing those opportunities. And that's really what the Israeli or the children of Israel and their economy was based on. So it was a principle of workfare and not welfare. The gleaning process required someone to go into the field and work. So nothing was free. And so Ruth went in, and she was a hard worker. It says that she was there from the morning to the evening. So you can tell she really gave a great deal of effort in order to get the grain that was needed for not only sustaining her, but also to sustain Naomi. So providing work allows a person to maintain their dignity as a productive individual rather than a dependent individual. Ruth was not just working for herself, but there was the effort to take care of Naomi, and work provided her the ability to give and to share with someone else, not just to work for herself. When we were in the inner city, we often gave people groceries because they needed them, but we also often gave them groceries where they could share them with someone else. So it gave them a sense of dignity where they not only had their needs taken care of, but they were able to help someone else. So it fostered with them a sense of sharing or giving and helping someone else in terms of their own personal needs. Ruth's care for her mother-in-law brought greater reward for Ruth and Naomi. There was also the principle of protection and safety. So you notice how Boaz says, I told my servants not to bother you, that he provided protection for her, and that she could drink also out of the water that was drawn, and also be able to go to the shade in the heat of the day. So in this Eastern culture, whoever was employed by you or was on your land, there was an obligation to make sure of their safety. And Boaz gives personal advice to Ruth to keep her safe. Who also gives instruction to his workers to leave her alone, and Ruth is given equal access to the water and shade like the rest of the laborers, and there was no place for discrimination. So even though she was a Moabitess, there was not a discrimination against her. Because she was the daughter-in-law of Naomi, there was respect given to her, and the stranger and the alien, as seen throughout the whole Old Testament, was always to be taken care of. And so Boaz was fulfilling that desire in terms of the guidelines for the children of Israel. There's also the principle of kinsman redeemer. And so if we go over to chapter 4 in Ruth, you'll see that this plays out very quickly. So it says in chapter 4, verse 1, No, Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So Boaz makes mention to Ruth and to Naomi that there's someone who is first in line. He's not the first one to redeem the land for Naomi. So there is someone else who has that role ahead of her. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 25, and I just want to read that passage for you, how God provided for those in case someone, husband died, someone else would help that individual and raise up children to the name of the person who had died. Because once again, it's about inheritance, it's about the land, and it's about lineage that goes along. So genealogy within Israel was extremely important because it was all tied to the land. So in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, it says, when brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside of the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of the dead brother, and the name that shall not be blotted out from Israel. So there again is the importance of the lineage and the genealogy within Israel. But if a man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my brother refuses to establish the name for his brother in Israel, and he is not willing to perform the duty of the husband before me. Then the elders of the city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I will not desire to take her, then the brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull off his sandal off his foot and spit in his face, and she shall declare that it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And in Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. So a covenant in the Old Testament at the gates of the city was often sealed by a sandal. So sandal was very important to you in terms of your footwear. And so it was like a down payment. It was a promise. It sealed a promise. And so we'll see this played out also in the book of Ruth. And so as Boaz comes to the gate in chapter 4, it says, now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative, the one who had the right to be able to redeem Naomi and the land, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. And he said, turn aside, friend, and sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. And so they sat down. And then he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And so I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here. So these are the witnesses, the elders of the gate, and before the elders of my people. And if you redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am after you. And the gentleman said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased of his inheritance. And the closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself, and you may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. So it's an interesting play out here where the gentleman says, oh, I really like to have the land. And Boaz then says, okay, if you buy the land, then you have to not only take care of Naomi, but you have to raise up children from uh, Ruth. And she's a Moabitess. And I'm sure that's where the problem came, because he didn't want to raise up children to a Moabite. And so he refused then to take on the ownership of the land and the responsibility that went with it. And so Boaz then is able to redeem it. So the propagation of family is directly related to the inheritance of the land. A person's name should not be blotted out because of the inheritance of the land would be lost. So Boaz initiates a process to give the near kinsman an opportunity to buy the land. With it comes Naomi and Ruth, and of course the kinsman refuses. So Boaz is willing to assume full responsibility and redeem the family of Elimelech, whose name means God is king. And so little did Boaz know that he would bring forth the King of Kings through his bloodline. Consequently, Christ's bloodline includes the widow and an alien and a stranger. So we see this mentioned into the genealogy right at the end of the book of Ruth. Now, these are the generations of Perez. Perez was born to Hezron. Hezron was born to Ram. Ram is an Abinadab. And Abinadab was born to Nahshon, and Nahshon to Salmon. And Salmon was born to Boaz, and Boaz Obed. And Obed was born to Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David. And so it brings him into the lineage of David, who would, of course, be the lineage of who Christ would come from. So here is a great understanding of God's divine work, where he includes very important women in the lineage of Christ, but he also involves or brings in women who are of a different nationality or a different nation. So really, in terms of Christ, he represents not only Israel, but he really represents the nations of the world as well as Israel. So some of the principles that we need to look at, and I ask you to look also over on 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verses 6 through 16, because once again, it gives us an idea of how to handle our finances and also the economy. And so let me just read that passage to us. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied with contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, and so we cannot take anything out of it either. And if we have food and covering, with these shall we be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and have pierced themselves with many a pang. And then I'm going to drop down to verse 17. It says, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to serve and to share, storing up for themselves a treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which life is indeed. So out of this passage, we realize then, in terms of our own personal economy, of how we should handle our riches or our finances. And so it's a very powerful passage to give us some instruction even for our current day. So Paul reminds us that we didn't bring anything into the world. We weren't assigned any standard of living at birth. Paul was used to wealth. He was born into a family which he was a Pharisee, so he's probably of a more wealthy class. We know he lived in a major trade city, so there was a lot of wealth that came through Tarsus. But that didn't mean he deserved it or that he would enjoy it forever. He held everything he had loosely, knowing that it all belonged to God. And he also knew that he was the direct result of God's design in his life. And he didn't have to add anything to it to please God. He just needed to do what God had designed for him to do, and that God would take care of the rest. So Paul says in many other passages, I'm fine with being, I'm content with being with riches, with being poor, with having all kinds of things with me. I'm okay with that. So whether I'm rich or I'm poor, I find contentment before the Lord. There are times when God is going to ask us to move down the economic ladder, and other times when he will allow us to move up the economic ladder. So whichever direction you're going, if it's guided by the hand of God, will be significant. Now, this is direct opposition to the expectations of the world, which always assumes that someone must move up in the world in order to be significant. So Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and I'll just read that passage to you. It says here, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? So once again, there's never satisfaction of just looking at riches and being involved in gaining more. That doesn't really satisfy the soul. So we can't take anything with us when we go. So whatever is of this world stays in this world, and what is ever laid up in the spirit realm before us and is stored in a vault where moth and dust cannot corrupt. So it is an inheritance incorruptible that fades not away, reserved in heaven for you who are kept by the power of God. 1 Peter 1, verses 4 and 5. So we are to lay up treasures in heaven. It's not about the treasures here on the earth. We can't take them with us, but to lay up treasures in heaven. And part of that comes out of Ecclesiastes, of doing that which is good. And the instruction at the end of 1 Timothy here, where he says, instruct those who are rich to do good and to be rich in good works. Psalm 49, verses 16 through 20, if everything is temporary, then how should we hold them? And we really hold them very loosely. Apparently, this is not a new problem. The psalmist answers was given the same as Paul. You can't take it with you, and when you get where you're going. So once again, let me just read that passage out of Psalm 49 and verses 16 through 20. Do not be afraid when a man becomes rich, when the glory of his house increase. For when he dies, he will carry nothing away. His glory will not descend after him. Though while he lives, he congratulates himself, and though men praise you when you do well for yourself, he shall go to the generation of his fathers, and he shall never see the light. Man in his pomp, yet without understanding, is like a beast that perishes. So once again, it wasn't just a New Testament issue, it's an Old Testament issue as well, of making sure that we realize that we can't take our wealth with us, but we can leave a legacy here on earth of how we've used our finances to benefit others, and also we lay up treasures by being rich in good works. So resolve the focus of essentials. So another principle is that there's only two things mentioned in 1 Timothy chapter 6, where he says, God will provide food and clothing in order to sustain us. So God knows what degree we need to be sustained. And so it's not necessarily that we have the latest fashions or we have designer labels, but we need to be content that God has provided food and clothing for us, and to be able to give him glory. When Nancy and I worked in the inner city, it really upset me so many times when I saw single moms trying to buy their kids the latest, Michael Jordan shoes, which were extremely expensive, or a Raider jacket, or whatever it might be, to give them a sense of status. And they were grossly overpriced, but it was once again, to try to give them and make a statement with the clothes. And often young people were killed over a pair of Michael Jordan shoes. And so it just shows you how foolish it is when we set up things as being the objective of our life, and that's what it gives us our identity. Unbridled desires also leads to a downward spiral emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Temptation, snare, foolish and harmful desires, ruin, destruction, evil, and wander away from the faith, pierce themselves with many a pang. So that's what he says here in First Timothy chapter 6. So we are to flee these things and pursue the qualities that bring spiritual contentment to our lives. Embracing kingdom values will bring freedom to the soul and release us from the pressures of materialistic society. So he says in verse 11, but flee these things, you man of God, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. So righteousness is right relationship with each other's, pursuing justice, godliness, the presence of Christ in you, faith in Christ, which you share with others and brings them into the kingdom of God, loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, and perseverance because we trust God's sovereign control of the universe to be able to supply our needs. So this is always going to be a battle for us, and that's what he says to us in this passage. Fight the good fight of faith. Take hold of eternal life for which you are called, and you made the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. So to let down is to have the enemy control and to fall into the materialism and the consumerism of our day. But he says, take hold of eternal life. So how can we experience heaven here on earth? Well, if we focus on the fact that we are created in the image of God, we are stewards of God, and if we use our possessions to serve God and to serve his kingdom, then that gives us, in a sense, great importance in terms of who God is, and it shows that we are God's servants on this earth. So make good the confession in the presence of witnesses by living free from the things of this world and being able to bring benefit to others and those around us. So some closing thoughts. Capitalism, even though it is flawed by human nature, is the best model of economics because it allows individuals the freedom to use their talents and hard work to accomplish the work that God has called them to. So every system can be used to serve God. But I think capitalism provides that sense of freedom. Economics is not about massing wealth, but of the distribution of goods and services so that the community, which includes everyone, benefits and is cared for. So don't let selfishness take over. It's not just about us, but it's about serving those around us and helping others be able to find strength and support and have their needs met. We are not autonomous individuals, but we're created in the image of God and charged with carrying out biblical mandates of shepherding the resources of this world in order the way that brings them to full potential that God intended them to be. In a sense, we become co-creators with God. So even in Genesis chapter 1, he says you are to, in a sense, tend or take care of the earth. So we're given a stewardship to be able to bring it to fruition. The church was never promised the land, so we're not Israel, but ours is a spiritual kingdom that culminates in a heavenly city where the rule and reign is with Christ. And even in the Old Testament, the fathers looked for a city whose builder and maker was God. So the church is not looking for a land, but we're looking for a spiritual kingdom. And therefore, what we do is we lay up treasures in heaven, not just laying up treasures here on earth. The Bible clearly teaches workfare rather than welfare. Every person is to work for their lodging, their food, and their clothing. 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10 says, if anyone will not work, neither let him eat. And then the Bible clearly teaches that compassion for the poor and our responses should take into consideration the circumstances that relate to why the person is poor. So those 5 words that we looked in the Hebrew tells us some idea of how we are to respond because of the circumstances of what caused the poverty in the person's life. And then the Bible clearly teaches us that we are to care for and protect those who are helpless in our midst, because God cares for us and he cares for the helpless. So contentment is not complacency, but it is a satisfaction with our life based on confidence in the sovereignty of God that he will provide. It is the absence of needing to have possessions to establish our identity, and it is the absence of the need for success or status. It is the presence of one dominant force in our lives, the desire to be like Christ and to do his will. And should God's plan for you include prosperity, that is wonderful. But should his plan also be one that involves the absence of things, you should be as content. For real satisfaction comes in doing the will of God, not in the things or the positions of power which money can buy. So when you think of missionaries who go on the field and really refuse all of the things, the wonderful things that we have here in the States, and they work overseas with great limitation, but many of them find great contentment because they know they're serving God and they're using their gifts and abilities to carry out what God has commissioned them to do. Because we brought nothing into the world, nor can we take anything out of it, we are to focus on the essentials and be grateful for every provision that we have from our Father in heaven. Unbridled desires will lead us to a downfall spiritually, physically, and emotionally. So we are to fight the good fight of faith and take hold of eternal life, which means that working to develop our spiritual life is the supreme goal of every Christian. And if we do this, everything else will fall into place and in its proper perspective. So I hope you'll join me in our Zoom discussion at 5 p.m. Love to have an opportunity to hear your insights from the book of Ruth, and also for us to be able to share together in terms of the questions that you have and that we gave to you. And so we look forward to seeing you and join us at 5 o'clock.